guys, it's Warners, and today I'm going to be continuing my series where I'm going to be ranking and rating the top 10 most improved spells from the player's handbook for each spell level. Oh my god, my cats are fighting. You can see their shadow.
Stop it!
Look at them. They're fighting. Stop fighting. And today we're going to be doing the top 10 most improved second level spells. What do I mean by rating and ranking? I'll explain that. So first of all, we're doing the most improved spells, 1 to 10. So these are spells that the new rules have changed for the better. Then I'm going to show you the old version and the new version, and I'm going to tier rank each version to kind of show you how much it's improved, in my opinion. Just so you know, these are all my opinion, so if you disagree, that's okay. And now that we've talked all about that, let's get into it. So first of all, here's my tier ranking system explained a bit. D tier is usually a spell that I just would never take or very rarely take, or a thing that is very thematic for your character. Then these spells are fine for that, but they're not going to be very powerful or helpful for you in most games. C tier are situationally useful spells, spells that don't always come up, or spells that do come up pretty often, but don't scale very well as you get to higher levels. At level 2, they're good, but maybe not so good later on. B tier spells are spells that are pretty good, but maybe not for all characters. Sometimes they're really good for a specific build, but depending on your build, you might not want to pick these up. A tier is your pretty simple, just great spell. Almost everyone wants to pick this spell up if you have access to it, and you're gonna love it. It's gonna be a good spell to use on this list, and it's probably gonna be useful every session or most sessions. S tier spells are spells that are so good it might be unbalanced or bad for the game. So spells that you might view as S tier might not be S tier for me because I'm specifically talking about spells that are almost too good. I also have a couple honorable mentions of spells that didn't quite cut the top 10 list, but are still technically improved. For our first honorable mention, we have Flame Blade. Flame Blade is a spell that you can cast as a bonus action, and then as an action, you can deal 3d6 fire damage, and it gives you some light. Not amazing at second level, and then it used to not upcast until you cast it at 4th level or higher, and then it would go up by 1d6. Now, it's technically improved. Now you add your wisdom modifier on top of that 3d6, and the upcasting goes up by 1d6 starting at 3rd level instead of 4th level. So it's technically an improvement, but I would still probably put this spell in D tier. Not a great spell, but it's technically better. And then the new Barkskin is now, instead of an action casting time, a bonus action casting time. And instead of being 16 AC, it is now 17 AC, which is a big improvement, but most druid spells that you're going to want to concentrate on give you a much bigger benefit than Barkskin. So I would still put it in D tier, but it is technically better. Editing Warners here. I just realized that the new Barkskin does not require concentration. So I would say this actually deserves a C tier, and it'll be my honorary number 11 on the list. So for number 10, we have Darkvision. Darkvision in the 2014 rules was an action cast spell, duration 8 hours, and it gave a willing creature you cast it on Darkvision out to 60 feet for the duration. This was kind of useful. A lot of D&D species have dark vision, so this would probably mostly be useful if you're playing a human, and then some other niche species options, like I think halflings don't have dark vision, but yeah, most species options do have dark vision, so it's kind of niche, and then it's only out to 60 feet. But then the new 2024 version is completely the same, except instead of being out to 60 feet, it is now out to 150 feet. So this is a big improvement. Even species options with superior dark vision only have it out to 120 feet. So this spell I feel like is actually pretty useful to pick up. So I rated the old version a D tier, and the new version I rate a C tier. And then number 9, we have Lesser Restoration. Lesser Restoration has always been a pretty good spell. It's an action casting time spell, and you get to cure 1 disease or condition from a creature, the conditions being blinded, deafened, paralyzed, or poisoned. And now the new 2024 version no longer has diseases because diseases aren't in the game anymore. It cures the exact same conditions, but now it is a bonus action. And especially for the classes that get access to this, you can make weapon attacks with your action and then still bonus action remove one of these conditions, which will come up a lot in my personal opinion. And for the rating, I rated Lesser Restoration a B tier previously. I think it's a spell that you probably had on your list, even though it didn't always come up, but it's something you always wanted to have. And now I think you want it even more because it's a super solid spell being only a bonus action. All right, number 8 is a bit complicated, and some of you might disagree with me, which is totally fine. So we have Find Steed. So Find Steed is a paladin spell, and with the old rules, bards could pick this up with magical secrets, but now that's no longer the case. Only paladins gain access to this spell now. Also, one unique thing about the new rules is it is gained as a class feature, so you no longer have to pick the spell. And the previous version of the spell didn't have an upcast, but it had a second spell called Find Greater Steed that paladins and bards with magical secrets could take. But now the regular Find Steed spell just upcasts to what Find Greater Steed was. This makes it very beneficial for multi-class builds because you could only have a few levels in paladin, gain access to Find Steed, and then multi-class into another caster and still have access to the improved form of Find Steed. Also, in the old version, you used to have to go through the monster manual, find the stat blocks that are available. Most people chose the Warhorse anyway, but it was kind of annoying to have access to the monster manual to use this spell, and now that's no longer the case. It has its own stat block, which we're going to skim through here in a second. But one of the nerfs to this spell that no longer applies to the updated version of the spell is that the 2014 version used to say this: while mounted on your steed, you can make any spell you cast that targets only you also target your steed. This has been omitted from the new version. This was a really fun interaction that Find Steed allowed that is no longer part of the spell, which kind of sucked and is definitely something to consider when comparing these two spells. But I think the options that the new stat block allows and the fact that you can multi-class better with this spell, I much prefer the newer version of the spell. Here's the Otherworldly Steed stat block. You have 3 options: Celestial, Fey, or Fiend. Each option gives you a once per long rest ability, which kind of sucks since it's only once per long rest. But because it's not just a Warhorse stat block, the HP scales with the spell slot level, which makes it a bit tankier. It has a 60-foot speed, and it eventually gets a 60-foot flying speed when you cast it at 4th level or higher. When you regain hit points, the mount also regains hit points, so that's one thing they kind of left in to kind of be like the whole spell thing that used to be on the other stat block. But as far as the bonus action abilities that each version gets, the Fiend gets Fell Glare. Basically, you get to do a bonus action Frighten on a target, and the DC equals your spell save DC. And if the creature fails, it only lasts until the end of your next turn. The Fey Step allows you to do a bonus action Teleport, which has you and your steed together teleport 60 feet. So it's kind of like a souped up Misty Step that you can use once per long rest. This is the most popular one that most people are going to go with. And then you have Healing Touch. You get to do a bonus action 2d8 healing plus the spell's level, which is fine. But yeah, I would say most people would probably go with Fey Step. But yeah, that is the Otherworldly Steed stat block. For the tier ranking, I would rate the old version a B and the new version an A. I really like the fact that this is now a paladin class feature, so you don't even have to prepare the spell anymore. That really helped with the A ranking for this spell. If you disagree with me, let me know down in the comments. Also, I have a character build video that I did last year around Christmas time that utilizes this spell a lot, so check it out up in the card. All right, number 7, we have Magic Weapon. So Magic Weapon is a spell that I didn't really even think about very much with the 2014 rules whenever I made builds. But it's definitely one to consider, especially if your dungeon master is a bit stingy with magic items. So what it used to do in 2014 rules is it was a 1-hour concentration spell, casting time a bonus action, and basically you get to make any non-magical weapon a magic weapon, and you got to make it a +1 weapon. And when you upcast it to 4th level, it made it a +2 weapon, and at 6th level, it made it a +3 weapon. Having a magic weapon specifically was was a bit more important in the 2014 rules because there was a lot of monsters that specifically had an ability where they took half damage to non-magical weapons. But since non-magical and magical weapons aren't really that big of a distinction when it comes to damage anymore, that aspect of it isn't as big of a deal. But this spell required concentration. Now, the new 2024 version no longer requires concentration. And yeah, you might have a +1 weapon at level 3, potentially, but if you don't, well, now you do. You can cast this a little bit before combat and you have it for a whole hour, and then you can concentrate on a completely different spell. And then when you get higher levels, it's very likely you could get a +2 weapon, but a +3 weapon might be more rare. So potentially, especially playing a Gish build, I could see Blade Singers really benefiting from this spell. You could get a +3 weapon at level 11, which is very nice. So I feel like this spell isn't like super good, but it's definitely an improvement and I really like it. So that being said, previously I felt like it was a bit more niche. You had to really want that +1, +2, or +3 to your weapon and sacrifice concentrating. But now, since you no longer have to concentrate on it, instead of being niche, I think it is a pretty good spell for some builds at a B, whereas previously it was a C. All right, number 6, we have Prayer of Healing. So Prayer of Healing, this spell, I feel like a lot of people would take, especially if you're a cleric, but also paladins would take it sometimes. Really great spell. Basically, casting time of 10 minutes and up to 6 creatures. They regain 2d8 plus your spellcasting ability modifier and hit point, and it would upscale by 1d8 per spell level. This was really helpful, especially if you play in a group that does a lot of combat encounters per day, or you're in a dungeon crawl and you're doing a bit more than usual. This spell was a really nice spell to pick up, especially on a cleric where you can change your spell list every morning. So I already liked this spell, but now the new 2024 version, it does all the same stuff it used to do, but it also gives you all the benefits of a short rest. They dropped how many creatures it benefits. It no longer benefits 6 creatures, it now only benefits 5, but being able to give everyone a short rest in 10 minutes can come in clutch often. And then if you're a cleric at level 10, you get the ability to once per day cast any 5th level spell or lower as an action with your divine intervention ability. So in the middle of combat, you could cast Prayer of Healing as an action and give everyone a short rest in the middle of combat. So yeah, I really like this new version of Prayer of Healing. They basically took Prayer of Healing and combined it with Catnap, and I really liked Catnap as a spell in the old rules anyway. So yeah, that being said, I feel like Prayer of Healing was a B tier and it is now an A tier. If you're a cleric that is level 10 or higher, it's an S tier. But for the generalized rating, yeah, it's an A tier. All right, the next 2 spells are very similar and the main things that have improved are the same. So let's go over it. So we have Moonbeam. So Moonbeam was a spell that always felt a little lackluster. It felt like it could be so much better than it was. And I feel like they made it what it always should have been. Let me go over the old version first though. The old Moonbeam, basically as an action and a concentration spell, you put this 5-foot radius, 40-foot high cylinder, then at a point within range. Basically it was like a moon beam, like the name of the spell, that would be on the ground and it would do radiant damage. One problem though is that it would only do radiant damage for creatures that ended their turn there or walked into the Moonbeam. So when you first cast the spell, even if you casted it on a creature, it wouldn't do damage unless they stayed in the Moonbeam. And so you would cast the spell on a creature, they would walk out of it, and then they wouldn't take damage. And it was a really small area anyway. So this spell only usually worked if you either had a corridor that the creatures had to walk through, or if you had someone that was restraining an enemy or grappling an enemy to prevent movement and keeping them in the Moonbeam. So this required a lot of teamwork, and then also you could move it as an action, but still the damage would only happen at the end of the creature's turn or if they chose to walk into it. So it was a small area and it had very unreliable damage. But then, the 2024 version, it almost works exactly the same except for this. It now says, when the cylinder appears, each creature in it makes a Constitution saving throw. On a failed save, a creature takes 2d10 radiant damage. But then it says, a creature also makes this save when the spell's area moves into its space and when it enters the spell's area or ends its turn there. So now it does damage when you initially cast the spell, and it also does damage when you choose to use your action to move it on targets. So that means that every single turn, even if the creature moves out, as long as they don't go 60 feet away, you can, as your action, put the Moonbeam back on them and they'll take that damage. And they also take damage if they end their turn there as well. So they didn't take anything away from the spell, they just added more. I love the changes of this spell, and I think it's really solid now. I rated it a C tier. I would say that it was a lower C tier, and now I would put it as a B tier. Not one of the best spells ever, but a really solid spell now. And then we have Clouded Daggers. It's a pretty small area, similar to Moonbeam. It's a 5-foot cube on a point you can see within range. This worked opposite of the old Moonbeam. Instead of a target ending their turn there and them taking damage, if they entered the space or if they started their turn there, they would take damage. But one unique thing about Clouded Daggers is it didn't require any saving throw. If they started their turn there or walked into it, they would take the damage. And it's magical slashing damage, so it wasn't a very resisted damage type. One downside of the old version though is you couldn't move it. So it did guaranteed damage, but you couldn't move it at all. So it was very situational, but still a pretty solid spell, especially at the level that you got it. And then it would upcast to 2d4 with its initial damage being 4d4. But with the 2024 rules, it got kind of nerfed in a way. They now don't take the damage if they start their turn there, and it works just like Moonbeam where they take the damage if they end their turn there or if they walk into it. But also the new version now has a very similar ability as the old version where you can, as a magic action, move it 30 feet. Clouded Daggers though, instead of dragging it across the battlefield, you specifically have to teleport it. That way you're not just like dealing a ton of damage throughout the battlefield. So that's how it is different from Moonbeam. But still, now as a magic action, you can do guaranteed damage to creatures as the Clouded Daggers enters their space. And it specifically says a creature can only take this damage once per turn, but if you, as your action, move it, that is one turn. And then if they end their turn in there, that is a different turn. So they can take the damage twice per round if they don't move. And I actually have a whole build video centered around the new Clouded Daggers, and you can check that one out in the cards as well. All right, I hope I explained that well and it wasn't all confusing. Anyway. So I rated the old version a C tier, very situational and just an okay spell, but the new version I rate a B tier. I really like this spell. All right, this one is unique where the spell actually has a completely different name, and I understand why they named it differently. I think Shining Smite sounds a lot better, but let me go over it. So branding Smite, first of all, this is using the old Paladin smiting rules. So in the old version, Divine Smite was a class ability. It was not a spell, so you could use a spell like Branding Smite with Divine Smite. It would cost 2 spell slots, but you could do that. Also, Branding Smite, how it used to work is you would use a bonus action and then you would concentrate on the spell, and if you hit, then you could add Branding Smite to that hit. And what it did is it did 2d6 radiant damage, and if the target is invisible, it makes them visible, and they shed dim light in a 5-foot radius. And they can't become invisible until the spell ends for a minute. And it would upscale by 1d6 per spell level upcast. This is a very situational spell. Any other Smite spell is going to do more damage. And there are times that you interact with invisible creatures, but it's few and far between, and you have to hit them first, which most likely you're going to have disadvantage unless you have some other way of seeing them. So not an amazing spell, but definitely not a terrible one. Mostly very situational though. But now we have Shining Smite, which first of all, it being a updated rules Smite spell makes it better. Now, instead of it being a bonus action casting time that you cast before you hit, now you can consume a bonus action while you hit, if that makes sense. So you hit first and then you can cast a spell, just like Divine Smite, but then it consumes your bonus action. And once you hit, it does the same 2d6 radiant damage, and it makes targets that are normally invisible visible, but also this gives you advantage on attack rolls against that creature for the duration. So whether the target is invisible or visible, this spell is very useful, especially if you're playing one of the subclasses that is not the Vengeance Paladin. It upscales similarly, but now, for example, if you are fighting an invisible creature, you don't have to concentrate on it before it's even doing anything. You now can wait until you hit to be able to get rid of the target's invisibility. So I really like that. This spell was kind of niche, and now it's useful for any paladin for the most part. So that being said, I rated Branding Smite a C tier, and now I rate Shining Smite as an A tier. Very good spell. All right, for number 2, we have Mirror Image, and this one is gonna take some explaining. So Mirror Image has always been a pretty good spell. It's an action casting time, no concentration, and what it basically does is it makes 3 illusionary duplicates of yourself. And with this old version, the spell basically got worse the more duplicates disappeared. So I'll explain it better. So you have these 3 duplicates, and every time a creature attacks you, you roll a d20. If you roll a 6 or higher, the creature attacking you hits your duplicate instead. But that's only if you have 3 duplicates. If you have 2 duplicates, you have to roll an 8 or higher. And then if you have only 1 duplicate, you have to roll an 11 or higher. So it kind of gets worse the more you get hit, but it's still a pretty good spell. Also, whether they meet your armor class or not, you have to roll these dice. And then the duplicate's armor class is 10 plus your dexterity modifier. And you're most likely a spellcaster, so even though your dexterity isn't super low, it's probably not your highest stat, so you're probably looking at a 14 AC. So at most, your duplicate is eating 3 attacks that might not have hit you otherwise, depending on your armor class. The new mirror image, though, works a bit differently, and I also like how simple it is. So now, instead of rolling a d20, you roll a d6 equal to the number of duplicates you have. So starting out, you have 3 duplicates, so you roll 3d6. Also, you only roll these d6s if you're hit. So the duplicates don't have a separate AC. Their AC is your AC. So you don't even have to roll these dice unless the target rolls higher than your armor class. And you're a spellcaster, so you probably have access to the shield spell. So this makes Mirror Image not only last a lot longer, but it makes it very useful for those rare situations where your shield spell isn't enough. And then how it works is you roll these 3d6s. If any of the d6s is a 3 or higher on the dice, then they hit your duplicate instead. So that makes it very simple, a lot easier to, and you most likely won't have to look at the spell over and over again for each duplicate that you lose. Also, the math is slightly more in your favor, it being at worst a 50-50 chance that it's going to hit your duplicate when you only have 1 duplicate left. So that's nice. With that being said, I felt like Mirror Image was a pretty good spell. It requiring an action sometimes made it feel not worth using, but now I feel like it is a super solid spell that if I'm playing a spellcaster that doesn't have a very high armor class, or even does have a very high armor class, I'm a lot more interested in taking and casting this spell in almost every combat. All right, and then we have number 1. This one you might have overlooked if you haven't delved very deep into the new player's handbook. So I'll kind of make this short and sweet because it's a pretty simple change, and most of you guys are probably familiar with the suggestion spell. So essentially it's an action casting time, and it lasts for 8 hours, but it's a concentration spell. And basically you get to charm a creature, and you get to suggest that they do something, and they will do that task instead of whatever they normally want to do. You can use this in combat, and sometimes it's really fun to use in combat because you can just make someone go home or tell them to sit down, you know, stuff like that. As soon as you or one of your friends damages them, though, the spell automatically ends. And then also when they finish the task, the spell also ends. This spell has always been very DM dependent, though, because of this one very important line. It says right here, the suggestion must be worded in such a manner as to make the course of action sound reasonable. Asking the creature to stab itself, throw itself onto a spear, immolate itself, or do some other obviously harmful act ends the spell. And an action that sounds reasonable is very vague. Like telling the guard to go home to some DMs might not sound reasonable, but maybe some DMs would consider that a reasonable suggestion. Like, oh, you get to go home early, why not? Also, the old spell said limit to a sentence or 2, which is also very vague, especially because you could do run-on sentences. So they cleaned it up a lot, and they made it way less DM dependent. So now it says, suggest a course of activity described in no more than 25 words, so same as the sending spell. But now it says, the suggestion must sound achievable. That's very different from reasonable. And then it says, and not involve anything that would obviously deal damage to the target or its allies. So yeah, you still can't suggest them to stab themselves, but now it no longer needs to sound reasonable. So the DM dependence is gone. Think about the shenanigans you could get up to with achievable being the only requirement. Think about what you could suggest to a king that has a lot of power, but might not be very mentally or magically powerful. The possibilities of this spell have always been huge, but now it's even more. I thought it was already a really good spell, and they made it even better. So it used to be an A tier, and it is now definitely an S tier. And now I would like to cast suggestion on you. It is very achievable for you to check out my new Bard subclass that I released on my Patreon. It is the College of Pantomime. This is your quintessential mime, but with a bard twist. You can cast spells without using verbal components, and you can make invisible walls, bridges, ropes, different ways to interact with the world, and tons of fun other little things. This bard was really fun to make, and if you guys don't know, I come out with a 5e 2024 rules compatible PDF once every month on my Patreon, and you can check it out down below. It is patreon.com/comradewarners. That being said, thank you guys so much for watching. Next month is October, and the PDF I'm working on now is the Executioner Barbarian. So that should be a lot of fun. I can't wait to show you guys the playtest, which I should be coming out with relatively soon. And I'll see you guys next time. Peace.